Well, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Sheffrin. I'm the Executive Director of the Murphy Institute. I'd like to welcome you to our Yates Lecture for this year. The Mary C. Parker Yates Lecture was endowed in 1996 by Murphy Institute alumna Rebecca Yates Villander in memory of her mother. It is designed to promote university-wide discussion of issues of current concern and to bring leading thinkers to the Tulane campus. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Mihir Desai, one of the country's leading experts on the role of taxation, finance, and international investment. His work has emphasized the appropriate design of tax policies in a globalized setting, the links between corporate governance and taxation, and the internal capital markets of multinational firms. Mihir Desai is the Mizuho Financial Group Professor of Finance at Harvard Business School and a Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He received his PhD in political economy from Harvard, his MBA as a Baker Scholar at Harvard, from Harvard Business School, and a bachelor's degree in history and economics from Brown University. In 1994, he was a Fulbright Scholar in India. His research has been cited in The Economist, Business Week, New York Times, and many other publications. He's a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research Public Economics and Corporate Finance Programs, and served as co-director of NBR's India program. As you can see, Professor Desai has a very broad portfolio of interest, and that carries over to his teaching. It's actually quite rare for someone without a JD to teach a major course at a major law school, but Professor Desai is teaching this spring personal taxation at Harvard Law School. He also worked at the Harvard Business School to develop ties between the business school and the undergraduate programs, where undergraduates at Harvard would be research assistants for business school professors. I first learned of Professor Desai's publications in international tax and investment. With his colleagues, he answered an important question. If firms invest abroad, does that mean, if multinationals invest abroad, does that mean they invest less at home? Many people think so. They use sophisticated techniques to basically show that when firms invest abroad, a shock that leads to a higher investment abroad actually leads to more domestic investment, not less domestic investment. And that led him and his co-authors to come up with a new approach to thinking about how to tax global businesses under the somewhat foreboding name of corporate ownership neutrality. Now, while many of us were trying to figure out whether last year's tax bill was good, bad, or whatever, I came across an interesting article in the Harvard Magazine by Professor Desai, and it was a wonderful article. You can find the article if you Google Harvard Magazine and his name. There's also a podcast there as well, so you could actually listen to him if reading tax is too hard. Although I knew his interests and backgrounds were broad, I was somewhat surprised when I discovered that he had written a book last year on the relationship between finance and literature. Very broad interests. So today we'll be talking about that book, The Wisdom of Finance. And then at the end, he'll talk a little bit about his upcoming interest and his next book project. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mihir Desai.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here, and particularly to be invited by Steve to talk with you about this book. I thought I would spend about 45 minutes talking about the book, spend maybe 5 minutes talking about a new book project, maybe steal that from you in the interest of getting some feedback. And then, of course, we can talk about whatever else you'd like to talk about. So when I told my publisher that I wanted the title of this book to be The Wisdom of Finance, he said, Mihir, it's good to be provocative, but oxymorons don't really work as titles. And I said, well, that's exactly the point. People don't put those two words together, wisdom and finance, and I want to try to put those two words together. So ultimately he bit, and I went on this journey of writing this book. So let me just tell you a little bit about where it came from, because it was rather serendipitous, and then I'll just walk you through some of the ideas in the book. So about 3 years ago, I was asked to give a talk to graduating MBA students. And I thought I would give a talk about things going on in the capital markets and share buybacks, and I had a whole thing I was going to be talking about. And then I was told that is not what I was supposed to be talking about. I was told that I was supposed to be talking about wisdom. And so I decided to come up with a title, which was The Wisdom of Finance. I was supposed to be talking about wisdom. I know something about finance. Put those two words together, and then I had to figure out what that meant. And like with many things, you commit to something and then you have to figure out what it means. And I was surprised by how easy it was to figure out what that meant. And quickly, as I was getting ready to give the talk, I was very quickly able to kind of think about a correspondence between the ideas of finance and ways we might think about our lives. And that turned out to be more robust than I had thought it would be. So I gave that talk, and it was enormous amounts of fun. And students were very encouraging. Just to share a story with you about, as a student, if you wonder what we as faculty get out of you, there are many things. In this case, after I gave this talk, I got an email from one of my students whose name I'll never forget, Andreas Antonius. He sent me an email, very nice, very kind email, and at the end he said, it would be a crime if you don't turn this into a book. And I made the mistake of sending that to my wife, who printed it out and taped it on my bathroom mirror. And I woke up to that sentence for a year and a half. And without waking up to that sentence, I would never have written this book. So that's the kind of encouragement that at least I needed to be able to write a book. So I kind of figured out, I gave the talk out, and it was really nice and it was fun. Started to think about turning it into a book. I actually thought you could just kind of write down the talk and get it published. And then I realized I didn't want to do that, nor was that feasible. And that I needed a lot more to kind of actually enliven this correspondence. That it wasn't just that the ideas of finance were interesting in a different way, but that actually we have to make it manifest in a really interesting way. And that's when I stumbled upon the idea of thinking about the humanities and using the humanities to actually enliven this correspondence between finance and ways to think about your life. The next big decision that I made that was a fantastic decision, is I cold emailed a author, a writer at the New Yorker who I like. And for reasons that are still not clear, he wrote back. And we ended up having 4 or 5 hour lunches where he taught me about stories. And he reminded me about how important stories are. So I'm a pretty traditional economist, as Steve laid out. And I'm always suspicious of stories and anecdotes because it's n=1 and we don't believe in that stuff. He reminded me that actually stories and narratives are how we organize our minds. And actually, if you want to do this, you have to think about stories. And so that was a really big piece of making this book happen. So let me tell you what the book is about and what it's not about. So it's not going to be about how to pick stocks, and if you want to get nudged into savings more, I'm not that guy. So it's going to be about something really different. So I took my inspiration a little bit from a lecture given by C.P. Snow, maybe 60 years ago now. Snow was a really remarkable person. He was a chemist. He served in the UK cabinet. He had a novel that was a finalist for the Booker Prize. Kind of a crazy guy, the kind of people we don't see anymore. And he gave this talk about two cultures and about how the sciences and the humanities had gotten divorced from each other and what a loss that was. And it's a really spectacular little book. But it struck me that the same thing was happening in the finance and the humanities. And in fact, there's a great deal of suspicion between those two domains. And I think that's a great loss. So the suspicion is something I'm sure you're familiar with, which is people in finance deride the humanities as being about things that are not that interesting or important. And people in the humanities deride finance as being vaguely evil. And that is a problem, because I think those two domains are all too important to each other, and that there's a great deal that one can learn from that intersection. So the premise of the book is, let's explore that intersection, and let's think about whether there's something there. It turns out, at least to my eye, that the humanities can actually illuminate finance in a really distinct and interesting way. And we can actually make these two worlds actually combine a little bit. And it turns out the ideas of finance actually have a surprising amount of humanity in them, much more than you might think as an outsider to finance. So that was the basic motivation. Hopefully, what comes out of that is a little bit of an elaboration of this quote. This is the epigram to the book. It's money is a kind of poetry. I quite like that quote because it's almost Gordon Gekko-like. right? Which is money's so beautiful. But the nice thing about the quote is that it puts together two ideas that people don't put together. And the really nice part of the quote is that it's by Wallace Stevens. So Wallace Stevens, says some of you may know, is, I think, maybe one of the greatest poets of the last century in America. And he's just a remarkable person, but maybe one of the most remarkable things about Wallace Stevens is not only was he a great poet, he spent his career in the insurance industry. And he never gave up working in the insurance industry. He spent his whole life at the Hartford. In fact, Harvard offered him the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship of Poetry, and he said, no, I want to stay at the Hartford. This does not happen that often. But he understood that actually these two worlds that everybody thought were totally separate, insurance and finance and poetry and the arts, were actually much more connected than anybody else realized. A number of his fellow poets made fun of him, kind of calling him bourgeois and not really understanding the poetic mentality. But he understood that actually these worlds aren't that different at all. So what do we get out of this? So here's the goal. What comes out of this, hopefully, is to let people into the world of finance. So finance is, I think, demonized, and for good reason sometimes. But part of it is just based on ignorance. And so the idea in the book is to say, let's let people into the world of finance. And let's meet them where they are, which is a way of saying no equations, no graphs, no numbers, just stories. And that will be a way in to the ideas of finance in a distinct way. That's the first kind of goal, which is maybe we can try to at least open up the world of finance in a way that will be new. The second thing that we're trying to accomplish in the book is, I think it's kind of difficult to be living a life in finance today. So people think what you do, again, is kind of vaguely evil. And we're in this bad equilibrium where we expect very little out of those people, and they deliver very little to us. And the idea here is to make people who are in the industry think about what they do in a different way. So the problem, of course, with finance is it's lost in a world of spreadsheets and screens and equations, and people lose the humanity of what they're actually underneath it all doing. So here's the kind of most ambitious version of the book, and maybe the slightly Panglossian version of the book, which is there's a huge chunk of finance that's broken. I think there's more value extraction going on than value creation in big chunks of the industry. How do we fix it? There are two candidate solutions out there. One is regulation, which I'm a fan of, but I'm also cautious about. I think many regulators get captured. Many regulations have unforeseen consequences. The other candidate solution is outrage, which I'm all for, but doesn't seem to lead to very much. The idea here is to say, well, let's actually take the people who go into finance and think about finance, and let's make it clear to them that there are noble ideas underneath what they do. And maybe if there are noble ideas underneath what they do, and they see that and they understand that, they will aspire to better behavior, as opposed to the cycle we're in now, where people expect little, they deliver little, and expectations kind of go down in a cycle that is not that helpful. So that's the basic motivation behind the book. All right, so let me just try to take you through some of the parts of it and give you a flavor for it. This slide will, I think, alienate many of you, but let's just try it. So this is kind of the textbook outline of the big ideas of finance. And it is also the kind of intellectual spine of my book. Of course, I would never name the chapters that, because then nobody would, read the book. But effectively, the intellectual spine of the book is all the big ideas of finance, but they're just done in kind of very unusual and idiosyncratic ways. So the first thing to say is, going back and thinking about this book made me think about a field kind of anew. And one of the lessons was, insurance is everything. You kind of revisit the big ideas of finance and you realize that insurance is core to everything. And so we start there. And we start with the idea of risk, and we start with the idea of insurance. Having established that, we open it up and think about the revolution in risk management. We think about tools like options, we think about tools like diversification, modern portfolio theory, the capital asset pricing model, all some of the big ideas in asset pricing. From there, we think hard about value creation. It's a lot of what we teach in finance is about how you measure value, what value creation is, where it comes from. And then we kind of turn. So for those of you who are well attuned to economics and finance, the first three are kind of asset pricing kinds of topics, which is a way of saying no firms, just disembodied risk. How do you price it? How do you think about it? That's what the first three chapters are really about. And then we take a left turn and kind of go to the corporate finance part of the world, where we introduce the frictions that we love to think about in corporate finance. And so we think about corporate governance, which is, I think, arguably the most important problem in modern capitalism. We think about mergers, and we think about leverage, and we end where we sometimes end, which is bankruptcy. Okay? So that'll give you a sense of where we're heading. I will say one last thing, which is the last chapter has this title, which is Why Everyone Hates Finance, which is just meant to say, I just told you how great all the ideas are in finance. Why does everybody hate it? And I'll advance a theory about why that is, about why people misbehave in finance, and why it's such an acute problem. I will just share one other story about this, which is, as an academic, we're used to kind of taking punches. We go give talks and seminars, and you kind of have to mix it up, and it's all fine. When you write a book like this, like a trade book, which I've never written before, it gets reviewed by people who you can't fight back with. And I will mention just one review, which was there was like a nice little paragraph in the New Yorker. There was like 4 sentences. First 3 sentences were really, really nice. And then the last sentence was just, a knife in the gut. The last sentence was, but Desai doesn't answer the most important question of all, which is the title to his last chapter, Why Everyone Hates Finance. To which I felt like responding, that's the next book. But you never get to respond in that way. So let me take you through this. Before we get started, I'll mention 2 last things. One is the 2 things I'm most proud of in the book are, one is the references section. You have to sacrifice all academic instincts when you write a trade book, basically. Or at least I decided to. Because if you want to make it readable, there are no footnotes, and I just overcompensated in the references section. So that's one of the parts of the book that I'm kind of maybe the most proud of. The second part that I'm the most proud of is there are pictures in the book. And I had to fight like heck to get my publisher to put pictures in the book. And so what I thought I would do is just show you the pictures as a way to tell you about the book. And I thought we could play a little game along the way, which is if you can name the pictures, you get a free copy of the book. So you just have to email me and tell me that you were one of the people who guessed correctly, and you get a free copy of the book. Okay? The first one's impossible, so we won't play with that. But from there, by the way, this never works. It's like I often never give away any books. It's kind of it's a terrible gig, but I have faith in you that it'll all work out. So the first chapter is about risk and insurance, and this is the goddess Fortuna. And of course, this is the original Wheel of Fortune that she's holding up there, and the original Vanna White, I guess. So I wanted to start with this because, of course, one of the puzzles is how it took us human beings so long to think through probabilities and how to think through that logic. And of course, part of the reason why is because we attributed everything to the goddess Fortuna. And so it prevented us from thinking necessarily about how to think probabilistically until some really big breakthroughs in the 17th and 18th century. But rather than talk about risk and insurance in the normal way, which would be with statistics or stochastic calculus or whatever, I'll try a different way. I'll tell you a story from The Maltese Falcon. So The Maltese Falcon is a wonderful novel by Dashiell Hammett, and it features a detective named Sam Spade, who's quite famous. If you're a Humphrey Bogart fan, it was like one of his first movies. So that book is known for a story called the Flitcraft Parable, which is kind of buried in the middle of the book. So here's the Flitcraft Parable. Sam Spade is talking to this woman who is both his prime suspect as well as the person he's falling in love with, which is what Sam Spade does, fall in love with his prime suspects. And he says, I want to tell you this story. And she says, okay. He says, I got this call one day. It was from this woman in San Francisco. And she called and she said, Sam, I just got a call from a friend in Spokane. And my husband disappeared 5 years ago. He woke up in the morning, everything was fine. He left, he never came home. Never known what happened to him. And she says, my friend in Spokane says that she just saw him. Sam, I want you to go to Spokane, Washington, find this guy, and find out if it's my husband. Sam says, okay, I'll take the case. He goes to Spokane, Washington. He actually very quickly finds the guy. He's like, are you Flitcraft? The guy says, yes. And he says, what are you doing? What happened? Why did you disappear? And this guy, Flitcraft, who now goes by the name Charles Pierce, is actually quite relieved to kind of unburden himself of this story. And so he said, well, I'll tell you what happened. I woke up that morning, I went to work, it was a normal day, I was going to lunch, and as I was walking to lunch, this iron beam fell from a construction site, and it landed right next to me. And a piece of the sidewalk jumped up and hit me in the face. And when that happened, I thought to myself, I'm living this really well-ordered life with a wife and kids and a job. And in fact, the whole universe is random. And I am out of sync with the universe. So I am going to go change my life at random to be in sync with the universe. And he just leaves. Just change his life at random. By the way, when I tell my wife that I'm going to start the book with this story, she's not impressed. But then Sam says, but the best part of the story is, when I found him in Spokane, he had recreated the same life he had had in San Francisco. It was exactly the same. Wife and kids and the job, everything was the same. So what's that story about? That story is about, and Hammett buries the clues in those names. So Flitcraft was the most important actuary at the turn of the last century, when the insurance industry began. And Charles Pierce is actually for Charles Peirce, who is somebody who Hammett was really obsessed with, who's a philosopher, an American philosopher. Those clues tell us that that little story is about risk and insurance. What's underneath that story? Well, underneath that story is the fundamental reality of life is that there's randomness everywhere. And that is the fundamental reality. And how do you deal with it? And the answer is, well, things that look seemingly random actually have patterns. And in fact, there are patterns everywhere. And if you understand those patterns, you can navigate this seemingly chaotic, random world. Which is, of course, exactly what insurance companies do. The other clue is Charles Peirce is an American philosopher, kind of a crazy guy. They don't make people like this anymore. He conducted the first randomized trial. He's the founder of semiotics. He's the founder of the American School of Philosophy of Pragmatism. He's kind of this amazing person, and he spent the latter part of his years kind of alienated from academia. He had had an affair. They kicked him off the campus. He was no longer allowed on campuses. So the story goes that William James, who's somebody who you might have heard of, a great American philosopher, invited him back to Harvard to give a talk, basically to rehabilitate him, because James knew that Peirce was the real deal, and he was like living destitute because no university would have him. So James invites Peirce to give a talk. They have special dispensation to allow him back on campus. He comes, he gives a talk. The room is packed in the philosophy department, and Peirce goes and he begins, and he says, "We are all insurance companies," which does not go over terribly well. He goes on to derive the first order conditions for pricing insurance. Again, this does not go over terribly well. William James basically throws him under the bus after that talk and says he was drunk. He wasn't drunk. What he understood is we are all insurance companies. What does that mean? Well, he's the founder of the American School of Pragmatism. Well, what is that all about? Well, the fundamental reality is chaos and randomness everywhere, and the only way through it is through experience. Much as insurance companies navigate randomness and uncertainty, we navigate randomness and uncertainty through experience, not through navel-gazing, but the pragmatism formula is experience leads to knowledge. And that's the sense in which we are all insurance companies. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what insurance is and risk is in maybe a different way. The rest of the chapter is a little bit about Wallace Stevens. It's a little bit about how mispriced tontine insurance contracts gave rise to the French Revolution, kind of different ways to think about what insurance is all about. All right, so maybe we can give away a book with this picture, or maybe not. It's not clear. We'll see. Anybody want to name who that is? It's Jane Austen, Katie Weaver. Oh, you already have the book. Okay. Yeah, sure you did, Katie, right. No, I'm sure that's true, Katie. All right, so, well, we can still get you a book, or you can give it to someone else. So this is Jane Austen, a famous author and a woman, arguably the best author of the 19th century, maybe. So when we think about risk management, we can think about it in a typical way, which again is to kind of anchor this in modern portfolio theory or Black-Scholes-Merton in the early 1970s or late 1960s, or we can talk about Jane Austen. So if you think about her novels, notably Pride and Prejudice, but a number of her novels, they are about risk management. So she makes it very clear that young men can make mistakes, but young women cannot make mistakes. And in some of these novels, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, what's the basic plot line? There's a young woman, and there are suitors who come along. The first one who comes along is rich, but drunk. The second one is nice, but ugly. You know, the third one is poor, but funny. It's like a risk management problem. You've got to figure out which of these suitors you're going to take. And of course, if you know Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins gives Lizzie Bennet the worst marriage proposal ever when he says to her, "You're not that pretty. You're not that rich. Here's an offer on the table. I suggest you take it." Which is roughly what he says in his proposal. And of course, he's playing off her risk aversion. And of course, her mom is like, take that right now. And of course, she says no. The next day, he gives that same offer to Charlotte, and she's like, yes, done. The neat part about this is this risk management problem that they face, they intuit and they give voice to what you might consider modern notions in finance of an option portfolio strategy and of diversification. So they're managing it in the way that we would have managed it and the way we think of managing it, but not in some modern way, but they're just giving voice to intuitions that are deep in who they are. So for example, in one of the Trollope novels, there's this fantastically unromantic woman, Violet Effingham. She has all these suitors coming by. She's got 10 suitors coming by. Her friend is like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to figure it out? And she basically says, if only I could marry all 10. Which of course is in many ways the essence of diversification, which is atomizing a choice and benefiting from that atomization. She gives voice to an option portfolio strategy about acquiring a bunch of options and then deciding when she's ready to take one of those options. So the idea here is to say these are not ideas that are modern, that came out of the 1960s or 1970s and modern portfolio theory. They've been with us for millennia. The first options contracts go back 2,000, 3,000 years. Diversification has been going on as long as shipping has been going on. These are ideas that are actually rooted in who we are. The chapter flips and then says, well, does options actually help you think about your life? And so for that purpose, I'll just maybe mention this briefly. When you write a book like this, they tell you you have to publish articles at the same time as the book coming out because it's supposed to help you sell books. It doesn't work, by the way. Other things work, but that does not work. I wrote a couple of these articles, and some of them got published, and then there was one article that never got published, and it was called The Trouble with Optionality. And I was getting very frustrated. I was kind of angry that I had to write these articles anyway. And so I called up the student newspaper, like right before graduation last year. And I'm like, will you publish this thing? No one else will take it. And they're like, yes. I was like, great, done. This turned out to be like the best publicity for the book ever. So in that article, I try to outline what the trouble with optionality is. So for those of you who know something about finance, people in finance are obsessed with optionality. I have young people coming into my office all the time saying, I want more optionality in my life. So what does optionality mean? Well, optionality is about the possibility of doing more without committing yourself to doing anything else. That's what makes an option contract so fantastic. Kind of a non-linear payoff structure. You're not obligated to do anything, but possibilities open up to you. And so young people, certainly at business schools and a lot of places, are talking about optionality. Give you a flavor for this. To them, marriage is the death of optionality. That's the way they think about the world. So what I observe is these young people who come into my office and talk about optionality and ultimately spend the next 30 years acquiring optionality. And they get good at one thing, which is acquiring optionality. And in the process, they misread the most important lesson of options, which is you buy options because they're insurance. And that should enable you to take on big idiosyncratic risks, which is what you're supposed to be doing when you take on a little bit of insurance. And what they do instead is just become good and become habitual buyers of safety nets. That's all they know how to do, which is in a way a misreading entirely of what options are all about. All right, so maybe we can try to give away another one. This is harder, so maybe Katie we should not allow to play, but we'll see.
Is that trading in the temple?
It is not trading in the temple. Anybody else? Okay, well, you get it because you ventured a guess. It's good enough. So this is the parable of the talents, which is in the book of Matthew. It's I think, a fantastic parable that also actually has the seeds of the intuition of value creation in it. So the parable of the talents is, roughly speaking, there's a master, and he's there, and he is about to go off. Talents, of course, we think to being things that make us special. It was originally money. It was a unit of weight. And the master is about to go off. He's got 3 servants. And he says, I'm about to go leave. And he goes to each servant and he says to the first servant, here are 5 talents. I'm going away. Take care of this. I'll be back. He goes to the second servant. Here are 3 talents. I'm going away. Take care of this. I'll be back. And he goes to the last servant. Here's 1 talent. I'm going away. Take care of this. I'll be back. He goes away. He comes back. And the master is obviously supposed to be the Lord in this parable. So the first servant comes up to him and says, Lord, I took your request seriously. I lent out the talents into the market. I took your 5 talents. I've made them into 10. Here they are. And the Lord says, welcome to the kingdom of God. The second servant says, Lord, I took your 3 talents. I lent them into the market. I made them into 6. Here they are, Lord. Back to you. And the Lord says, well done. Welcome to the kingdom of God. The last servant says, Lord, I only had 1 talent, and I really wanted to make sure it was going to be okay. So I buried it to make sure it was safe. And here it is, safe. Back to you, your 1 talent. And he says, you're damned forever. This is a pretty strange story. So what is that parable about? Of course, it's a parable about being stewards before other people's things that they've given you and ensuring that you make the most of the gifts that you've been given. And in fact, the founder of Methodism used this parable to give his most famous speech, John Wesley, about giving as much as you can to as many as you can for as long as you can. Buried in there, of course, is the essence of what we teach in business schools about where value comes from. A lot of what we teach is you are the stewards of other people's capital. They have very high expectations. It's called the cost of capital, which is based on their expected returns. In order to create value, you have to exceed those costs of capital. And that is the sine qua non of value creation. And if you really want to create value, you've got to beat your cost of capital for as long as you can, and you've got to grow, and you've got to put the proceeds into work to actually create value, which is very much related to the underlying story here. And in fact, that is what John Wesley points out in his sermon on money, which is based on this parable of the talents. The cheekiest part of this chapter is all about the capital asset pricing model. Very briefly, here's the 30-second drive-by of the capital asset pricing model, which is the way we price risk in finance, at least historically, has not been by measuring risk in terms of overall volatility, but what matters, in fact, are covariances, or betas. The underlying idea here is in the context of a diversified portfolio, betas are what matter, and pricing should reflect that. High beta assets need high expected returns. That is equivalent to saying they should have low prices. High expected returns give us low prices. Negative beta assets move against your portfolio. They're fantastic for that reason. As a consequence, you're willing to live with negative expected returns. That's high values. What does that have to do with life? I just try to make the case in this chapter that actually that's a pretty good way to think about relationships in your life, which is there are high beta relationships in your life, high beta assets. They are instrumental friendships you have. They're like your LinkedIn network. They can be the source of great value creation, but they disappear when you're down on your knees, and they flock around you when you're doing well, much like high beta assets do. And you shouldn't confuse them with really valuable assets. The really valuable assets, of course, are the negative beta assets in your life. The people who are there for you when you're down on your knees, the people who pull you down when you fly too high, those are negative beta assets. Those are the really valuable people in your life. And sometimes, for anybody who has kids, they're even associated with negative expected returns. Let's try to give away one more book. This, I think, maybe this is our best shot. This one or the next one is our best shot. Or maybe not. You got nothing to lose. The last person who guessed got a book just for guessing. Somebody said Zero Mostel. Jim, Zero Mostel, that is a correct appreciation of who this person is. Can you take it to the finish line, Jim? Anyone else? It is Zero Mostel. You definitely get a book for that. This is Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder, and this is the producer. He got it. It's The Producers, which is a fantastic Mel Brooks musical. So corporate governance, of course, is the centerpiece of modern capitalism in the sense that we have principals and we have agents. We have the separation of ownership and control. And that principal-agent problem is the problem of modern finance in many ways. One way to think about that is, through the models of Oliver Hart or Bengt Holmstrom or whoever. The other way to do it is through Mel Brooks. So what's the basic plot line in Mel Brooks, in The Producers? These two crazy guys, Bialystok and Bloom, come up with a great idea. They're kind of hucksters. And their great idea is they will put on a Broadway musical, and they will raise money from a lot of naive investors. And they'll raise way more money than they need, like 200 times the amount of money they'll need. Then they will put on a musical, and it'll be the worst musical ever. And it'll fail right away. And then the investors won't want their money back because they know it's just a huge failure. And they'll go off to Rio. They build this musical. It's like the most tasteless musical ever. It's called Springtime for Hitler. The worst actors, the worst directors, the worst things, everything. And of course, it becomes a huge hit. And they go to jail. What is that about? That is about the principal-agent problem and the miracle of kind of modern capitalism, which is investors. If you ever want to read a great survey of corporate governance, the Schleifer-Vishny survey has this great sentence in it, which is, the miracle of capitalism is investors give managers money and managers give it back. Which is a way of saying that is the whole problem in modern finance. And of course, that's the problem of Bialystok and Bloom. So just as a way to think about this, Apple has a shareholder revolt 5 years ago. It's a really remarkable moment. The shareholders get angry with Tim Cook for holding on to so much cash. At the time, he had 120 billion in cash. Now he's got 300 billion in cash. But they say, you have to give us back our cash. In effect, what happens? David Einhorn, Joe hedge fund guy, mounts a proxy war against Tim Cook and says basically, you're my agent, you're not doing your job, give me back my cash, I'm your principal. Of course, the story is more complicated because, in fact, David Einhorn, Joe hedge fund guy, who is the principal to Tim Cook, who is his agent, David Einhorn is himself an agent to some principal at some Canadian pension plan. And by the way, the woman who runs the Canadian pension plan, of course, who is the principal to David Einhorn, who is the principal to Tim Cook, she herself is the agent of some Canadian pensioner. And that's the sense in which all of modern capitalism is a daisy chain of principal-agent problems. I think it's also a useful way kind of to think about your life. So this is maybe the hardest thing I had to do in this book, and I'm not sure it was a great idea, but I tried to do one personal kind of story in this book and to try to elucidate the principal-agent problem and how it applies in many settings. Obviously, it applies in work settings. So anytime you've been delegated a task or you are delegating a task, the principal-agent problem is what makes that so complicated. You know, how does somebody monitor you? How do they check in on you? How do they incentivize you to do the right thing? That's the basic principal-agent problem. So it applies in many places. It also came to me when we were struggling with this personal issue. It was several years ago, right after my father had passed away. My mother was living by herself. And she had a woman who was staying with her to help her, but she was living by herself. And my sister and I, we lived very close to each other. And we were very worried about my mom and depression. And so we're talking, and we're like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Flash of brilliance hits us. We're going to move Mom. We'll move Mom close to us. And she'll be close to us. We'll break the cycle of loneliness. She'll be close to her grandkids. Everything will be better. I go talk to my mom. I'm like, Mom, we got an idea. I lay out the whole thing. I'm like, we're going to move you. It's going to be great, blah, blah, blah. She says, no, not interested. I say, I don't think you understand. Let me try it again. I go through it again. I'm like, this is going to be great, blah, 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 blah. And she says, no, not interested. And in that moment, I kind of thought to myself, what the heck was going on? And in many ways, I thought I was serving as her agent, undertaking something on her will. Or maybe I thought I was serving my father, who was kind of a hidden agent, hidden principal in the background. But of course, in the process, I had made her, and we had made her into our agent. We wanted her to be near us. We didn't want to schlep to go see her. We wanted our kids to grow up to be with her. And in the name of serving her as an agent, we in fact had made her into our agent. And that confusion, I think, happens a lot in life when we find ourselves either being principals or agents without knowing who we are. This chapter ends with a story about Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft, who was married to Mel Brooks for 30 years. Anne Bancroft was an actress, was a great actress. Mel Brooks was a director and a writer. So the chapter ends with this story, which is Mel Brooks is at home writing. Anne Bancroft comes home one day after a day of acting. She's really angry. She's like, the director was terrible, the script was terrible, I hated everything today. And Mel Brooks, after a little while of listening to this, says, enough. You want to know what's hard? And he holds up a blank piece of paper. He says, that's hard. Which is a way of saying, it's hard to be an agent, but the really hard thing in life is to be a principal. And in fact, many of us struggle trying to figure out when we are in fact principals and when we are in fact agents. All right, this is our best, I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. Or if anybody wants the book on this one. Yes. There we go, the Arnold Feeney portrait. Send me an email, mdesai@hbs.edu, and I'll send you a book. In this chapter, I'm not going to go into detail. I just try to think a little bit about mergers and try to put the worlds of romance and finance together again. There's a great song, No Romance Without Finance, which is a way of trying to put together things that we kind of think of as being very, very different. Just briefly, this portrait is interpreted by some as being symbolic of a payment of a dowry. She's not pregnant. And in fact, through the course of writing this book, I found this fantastic example of kind of finance and romance being tied together, which is the dowry fund. So briefly, what is the dowry fund? A dowry, by the way, is a payment by a father of a daughter to a groom. That's what a dowry is. So it's Renaissance Florence. It's the early 1400s. There are three big problems. Problem number one is dowry prices are going through the roof. Young men are at a premium. The bubonic plague has reduced their population a great deal. So young fathers are really worried about dowry price inflation. Second problem, husbands or grooms are getting stiffed. So they marry the young girl, and then the father never pays. Problem number three, Renaissance Florence needs financing. Voila, the dowry fund is born. You know, what is the dowry fund? The dowry fund is fathers of daughters, young daughters at age 5, put money with the state. They get a very high interest rate. It protects them from the dowry price inflation. At the age that the girl, which she matures at age 15, the bond is paid back, but not to the father, straight to the groom. Ensures that problem gets solved. And in fact, this is the majority way Renaissance Florence is financed. This is a way of trying to put together the worlds of romance and finance, in particular mergers, and thinking about how the folklore around mergers helps you think about the folklore around marriages. All right, this one we have a chance at giving away a book. Focus on the building in the background and the guy whose hand is reaching out. The Merchant of Venice. Thank you. All right, good. So send me an email. I'll send you a book. So that play, of course, is about debt. There is a circle of debt going on between Antonio and Bassanio and Portia. That's Shylock. This is the famous Pound of Flesh play. Of course, it has nothing really to do with debt. The scholars who study this play know that it's all about love. In fact, there's no Shakespeare play where the word love shows up more than The Merchant of Venice. And there's all that wordplay about the bond between two people. And in fact, it's all about relationships. So this is just a way of thinking about leverage and why people in finance love leverage. People in finance love leverage because you make a commitment to somebody and you get the ability to do something you have no right to do. You get to live in a house you have no right to live in. You get to buy an education you have no right to buy, all by committing yourself to a lender. That's why we in finance love leverage. It allows you to control assets you don't get to control otherwise. In this chapter, I just try to tell the story of how commitments writ large are quite analogous to the way you think about leverage. And some people like to live high leverage lives, and some people like to live low leverage lives. I give two polar examples of that, two kind of creative people who use leverage in very different ways. The low leverage guy, just like we have low leverage firms in the economy, is George Orwell. Post-World War II, he is getting sucked dry by commitments in London. What does he do? He runs away to the Scottish Islands. He locks himself in a house for 3 years. He writes 1984. That's a low leverage guy. Who's a high leverage guy? Jeff Koons is a modern artist. He's the exemplar of a high leverage guy. Also, by the way, if you don't know who he is, he's like a big modern artist. He creates massive sculptures the size of that room over there. He started as a cotton futures trader, and he really understands leverage. So what does he do? He employs about 150 people. He doesn't even know how to use the material that he makes the art out of. He's gone bankrupt 4 times. He bankrupts dealers all the time. He knows how to use leverage to his advantage. It worked out pretty well. The Whitney Museum just gave him the whole building as a dedication to his life's work. That's a high leverage life. It kind of even goes more general. In this chapter, I end with Jefferson, this great Jefferson quote. And the cover of the book actually has Archimedes on it. So if you've ever heard the quote from Archimedes, give me a place to stand and a lever, and I can move the world. The great thing about levers is they multiply your force. The quote I end with is on Jefferson, which is in a letter he basically says, "I've always thought it best to do the right thing because your reputation, like Archimedes' lever, is the most powerful thing and will let you move the world." Which is a way of saying you bind yourself, you constrain yourself, and you commit yourself to good behavior, and the world allows you to do crazy things you have no right to do. And that is the power of a good reputation. All right, this one I can't really give away. It's it's impossible. It's Daniel Defoe. But the last story I will maybe give away a book on is, anybody know who Robert Morris is? No one ever knows who Robert Morris is. Anybody know who Robert Morris is? Jim, for 2. We've all learned something. Indeed, Jim. We all just learned something about Jim. This is fantastic. All right, good. So 2 books for Jim. So Robert Morris is the richest man in the colonies, and he's the financier of the Revolution. His scrip underwrites the Battle of Yorktown. During the Articles of Confederation, he is the first president of the Bank of the United States. He gets asked to be the first Treasury Secretary before Alexander Hamilton. And you don't know who Robert Morris is. And Alexander Hamilton's got his own Broadway musical. So what went wrong? He says no to Washington. "I can't be your Secretary of Treasury because I need to recoup my wealth." And he goes ahead and he recoups his wealth. He becomes incredibly wealthy. It's unclear, hard to make comparisons across time, but arguably one of the most wealthy people in the world. He owns about 30% of New York State. He ends up with about 1/3 of the District of Columbia before it's the District of Columbia. And then what happens to him? He goes bankrupt. And what do we do with people who go bankrupt? We put them in jail. And so he ends up in the 30th Street Jail in Philadelphia. The reason I like that story is it's a story about how we came to redefine failure. So Robert Morris goes to jail, and George Washington and the other founding fathers visit him, and they basically say, "What are we doing punishing people who fail?" That doesn't make any sense. And that is the origins of the 1800 Bankruptcy Act. The 1800 Bankruptcy Act redefines bankruptcy and failure away from death and towards the modern finance notion of bankruptcy, which is all about rebirth. We protect the people who fail. We get them resources. We ensure that they actually are protected from the creditors who are the nasty people. Completely flips the script on what failure is about. And that bankruptcy notion in finance is actually a pretty nice way to think about failure in your life as well, which is should be about forgiveness, including of yourself or of others who fail, rather than punishment. And the last part of this is just about how it's not quite that simple, because sometimes people go bankrupt strategically, and sometimes people in your life fail strategically. And the big problem of life is trying to figure out which is which. If you think about strategic bankruptcies, you might be able to think of an example or 2 or 3 if you strain your imagination. People who kind of take advantage of the bankruptcy code to do things they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And that kind of gives rise to a lot of the complexity of dealing with people in your life who fail. All right, let me just finish with this one. Briefly, this is meant to answer this question, which I don't apparently fully answer, which is why everyone hates finance. So just briefly, the underlying idea here is, first, is simply to say all the portraits of finance in fiction are terrible. They're like endless avarice. It's just horrible. There's one shining exception, which is Willa Cather in O Pioneers. There's a woman in that novel whose name is Alexandra Bergson. She does everything we just talked about. She does an LBO of the family farm. She buys options. She diversifies. She helps people who go bankrupt. You see the full panoply of things that we see in finance. Here's the great part. She doesn't turn into a jerk, like every other protagonist in every other finance novel there is. Why doesn't she turn into a jerk, like every other finance protagonist there is? And the answer is, she gets right something that most people in finance get wrong. So why do we end up with more than our disproportionate share of Martin Shkreli's, kind of nasty people who do nasty things all the time. I try to argue in this chapter that the distinctive thing about finance is, in finance, especially if you're on the investing side, you get immediate feedback that is highly quantified at a scale that is magnified by leverage. And you have to make sense of that. And people in finance do what people in every field do, which is they make attribution errors. Those attribution errors are basically what? Everything good that happens because of me. Everything bad that happens because of the world. And in fact, to be a good investor, you have to do those attribution errors. That is the only way to try to actually survive. In the process, what do? Well, when you get all that feedback at that scale and at that pace, and with that precision, you actually start to believe that stuff. And you become a jerk. And because that process of feedback happens at a scale and at a speed which is unlike other fields, we generate more than our fair share of jerks. Alexandra Bergson does not become a jerk because she understands the most important lesson of finance, which most people in finance forget. Which is, of course, when she's asked, she starts out as, the family is about to fail in the farm. She ends up a fabulously wealthy landowner. And she's asked, how did you do it, Alexandra? What did you do? How did you become so wealthy? And she says, it was just the land. Which is a way of saying she understood something that many people in finance forget, which is there is no field where it is easier to dress up luck as skill than in finance. And the problem for people in finance is they start to believe that they can actually tell the difference between skill and luck. And in the process, they become jerks. The deepest lesson in efficient markets and in a lot of finance is it's almost impossible to tell the difference between skill and luck, other than over very long horizons, and then only if you really buy into a lot of assumptions. And that's the sense in which that is the lesson of finance that escapes most people, and it is why people in finance become jerks, because they come to believe their own hype in some sense. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what the book is about, and what I tried to do. Maybe I'll just wrap up, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the next book, if that's okay, and then we can talk about whatever else you'd like to talk about. So unsurprisingly, it's pretty straightforward. The gulf between finance and the humanities, I think, is a complete loss. We can actually use some of the humanization that the humanities provides, and Lord knows we need it in finance. And it turns out that I think the humanities can lose their caricature of what finance is. Actually, a reasonably noble set of ideas, regardless of what you might think of the current state of practice, which is highly problematic in many ways. Okay, so that's a little bit about what the book is. If it's okay, I'll steal 5 minutes and tell you a little bit about the next book, which is totally different, but I'd love to get some feedback. If it strikes anybody's interesting, I'd love to hear. It has nothing to do with anything that we just did, other than it's a little bit about finance. So I'm going to try to do this with 2 stories, because as you can tell, when you write these trade books, part of what's important is you have stories. So I'm going to try these 2 stories, and I'd love to get your reaction to these 2 stories. So the first story is from October 2015, so it's 3 years ago, and GE, which is a very large US company, announces that they're getting rid of their finance business. This is a really big deal at the time. And they have an iconic CEO, whose name is Jeff Immelt. And there's this iconic hedge fund guy, whose name is Bill Ackman. Reporters ask Bill Ackman, what do you think about GE doing this? So what does Bill Ackman say? Part of the reason I like this story is because there's these iconic people. So what does Ackman say? Ackman says, by the way, background of the story, GE is known as a place where you go work and then you go become CEO somewhere else. Like they're a breeding ground for talent, okay? So what does Ackman say? Ackman says, GE is a great company, and they're really managed well, and they really know how to teach managers how to manage. But, there's a big but they've been an absolute disaster as an investor. He goes on to say, yeah, GE is a great company, but they have no idea what they're doing when they invest. And then he says, but I think now they figured it out, and I think they actually understand, and they're getting the religion on what's called capital allocation. Okay, so what is that story about? And the headline is, Ackman says, GE, great managers, terrible investors. The reason I like that story is implicitly, what is Ackman saying? I think what Ackman is saying is the following, and it's not really a story about GE. I think it's a story about a lot of things. What Ackman is saying is, managing is nice, but it doesn't matter. What matters is investing. And if you invest well, that's all you have to do. Managing is for the little people. Ackman is saying, what I do, investing, allocating capital, is what matters. That's the way I read that story. To me, that signals the rise of and the completion of the ascendancy of investors in the economy and the investor mentality. So the revolution of the last 40 years is the rise of institutional investors and their force and their domination of the economy. I'm not talking about shareholders. I'm talking about the rise of alternative assets, hedge funds, private equity, the rise of mutual funds. Their preferences have come to dictate the way managers think about the world and the way a lot of things work in the world. And that is both fantastic and absolutely horrible. And a lot of problems that we observe, I think, today are the result of an investor mentality run amok. I'll give you one other story, and then we can pause. The other story is I go for dinner with these undergrads who invite me to dinner once in a while. And it's like very nice when the undergrads invite you for dinner. It's like a lovely occasion. There's like tablecloths. It's all very special. The kid who invites me is this really nice guy. He's like a senior. We start talking. We have a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion. It's near the end of dinner. What are you going to go do next year? He says, oh, I'm going to go work in this private equity company in Asia. I'm like, great. Talk a little bit more. I decided to push him a little. I said, why do you want to go work there? He says, well, you know, I love investing. I'm like, okay, great. Decided to push him a little bit more. He said, why do you love investing? I love finding great companies. Okay? I say, okay, fine. So tell me, what's a great company? And so what does he say to me? He says, you know what's a great company? He says, Visa. I've been pitched Visa. Visa is the credit card processing company. I've been pitched Visa like 15 times by former students. I say, okay, tell me, why is Visa a great company? He says, you know why Visa is a great company? Asset light, no CapEx, recurring revenue. You cut a little piece of the transaction, no one even notices. It's quasi-oligopolistic. It's fantastic business. Those words, asset light, no CapEx, those are the mantras in business today, which is a way of saying nobody wants to own hard assets. And I said, that's great. And dinner finished. And I walked outside, and I thought to myself, when did that become our idea of a great business? So my father works in the pharmaceutical industry, which has changed dramatically since he was in it, but he thought a great business was investing in R&D, creating drugs, and distributing them and selling them. And the idea of a great business that's dominant today is Visa. And by the way, I can appreciate why it's a great business model. Like, I understand enough about finance to know why people love that business model. But when that becomes our idea of a great business, that's really problematic. So the book is meant to trace out the way that happened, which, for those of you who are old enough in the room to know, has a lot to do with ERISA and pension reforms in the 1960s and 1970s, which basically gave rise to investment management as an industry. And it traces how, through a set of accidental quirks, we ended up with the rise of alternative assets and then the rise of the institutional investor. And then the book is going to go through and trace through how it impacted capitalism through some case studies, how it impacts social policy, I was talking with Steve earlier about tax credits. If you think about the way we finance public housing in this country, we do it with investors. We no longer build Section 8 housing. We just auction off tax credits. In the process, they shape the kinds of things we do. I think the non-for-profit sector has been seized by a investment mentality. Endowments and foundations have been consumed by an investment mentality, and it is kind of everywhere. And it is both fantastic and terrible. The book is not meant to be a screed. There's actually a lot of great things about it, but it's actually also, I think, really very problematic. Okay, so that was a lot, but that's basically 5 minutes on the new book.
Well, let's first thank
Sure. Thank you.